So the classic romantic continuum is a basic concept that has to do with two antithetical concepts. And so we are going to talk about this within the context of the common practice period. And so just to review these dates, and these eras, represent in many ways different opposing style, and has to do basically with the opposition of objective and subjective elements, and which of those is more highly valued. So the classical era is an era that places great value in objectivity. And so terms like ethos, which has to do with the basic principle that underlies the philosophy for how decisions are made. And so this has to do with basic objective principles, is in opposition to something which is more subjective in orientation, which has to do with things that are more emotional or a matter of opinion. So the term pathos describes that. So pathos has to do with eliciting an emotional response. So some ways that this plays out in music has to do with the relationship between form and emotional content. So in this classical style, form dictates emotional content. So an example of that would be that you have specific expectations for the character of themes in certain sections of form. So we talked about sonata-allegro form last time, and I made the statement that in general, the B theme, the second key theme in the exposition, tends to be more lyrical. And so that's something in which that particular spot in the form dictates the character of that theme, that it's more of a singing theme. In the romantic style, the more subjective style, it's just the opposite. And in that style is the emotional intent of the composer that dictates the form. So it's just coming from different points of view as far as the relationship of those objective elements, which are the elements that are embodied by the principles that you study in freshman and sophomore theory. And so that idea that developed at the beginning of the Baroque era was described by the theorist and composer Rameau, who wrote a very important work that's called Treatise on Harmony. This is a really important document. And so it's like a scholarly paper that describes what composers were doing at the beginning of the 17th century. And in this document, this treatise, Rameau makes the statements about the idea of triads and seventh chords, the idea of vertical combinations of tones that create harmony. And so Rameau's idea was that it's harmony that drives the forward motion of music. And so he's looking at that element as something which is a basic component, and that's something that hadn't really been articulated before. So you should know about this important treatise. And I'll just write here that this describes tertian. And again, tertian harmony just has to do with harmony that's based on the interval of the third. And so that describes the basic principles for this 300 years of composition. All right, the classic romantic continuum then has to do with the pendulum that swings back and forth between these two basic concepts throughout music history. So the Baroque style is also described as a style that is emotional, but it's a different type of emotion than the 19th century romantic emotionalism. So in the Baroque era, composers were basically writing either for the church or for the court. Those were the two ways that they were employed. And their role was either to glorify God or to glorify the king or whoever was the aristocrat that they were writing for. So it wasn't something that was intended to, be a glorification of themselves. So the Romantic period, though, is more of an individual expression. And we'll see that beginning at, with the turn of the century with Beethoven's works. And so we'll talk about the elements of classicism and romanticism in this first section on the symphony. All right, so what I'd like to do first today is to look at this example of sonata-allegro form. So if you'll open up in your notes to that diagram that I made for you, and I'm going to hand out a copy of this example that we're going to do, and then I'm going to pick it back up. This is available to you on the website. And if you go to theme sheets, and so a lot of you have printed this off, and go to symphony, that's the first thing that will show up is a copy of this. So how many of you need a copy of this? Because everybody should have one copy. So you guys all have one? So that's like, yeah. One thing that I'm going to have you do on Thursday is to diagram sonata-allegro form. So we'll just spend 5 minutes in class doing that, okay? So study that for Thursday. The things that you should be able to diagram about this are the 4 different places within the exposition that you're looking for thematic points. So A theme is in tonic. The second idea to label is the transition that modulates the second key. And then third thing is the B theme. That occurs when then that second key arrives. It's articulated by a cadence point. And then there'll be a closing theme at the end of the exposition. So those 4 places you want to be looking for. Then you will see double bars and repeats around the exposition. And then the next section is the development section. You should be able to describe melodically and thematically what's happening. So melodically it develops themes, motives from the exposition. It's discussing those using sequential treatment, maybe having polyphonic textures. It will modulate through closely related keys. And that section will be shorter in a classical composer's work than the exposition, so half to 2/3 of the length typically. It has a final passage that arrives on the dominant harmony that prepares then the final section, which is a return of the opening material in time. So all the material from the exposition is restated, only now it doesn't modulate to the second key. So you should be able to diagram what keys you expect. So in the exposition, if it's in a major key, you expect it to go to the dominant key. If the movement is in a minor key, it'll go to relative major. And so I'll have you do this on the first test, but we're going to look at lots of different examples of sonata-allegro form. Okay, so study that for Thursday. All right. So how many of you were able to figure out what was going on? And did you identify where the recap occurred? So where was the recap in this example? So what are you looking for with the recap?
Was it the tonic key?
Yeah, it's back to the tonic, and it also does what? Restates the opening theme, right. So one of the questions you have to ask is, does this start with an introduction or not? And this particular example doesn't start with an introduction. It starts straight away with the statement of the A theme. And so it's that A theme that you expect to return about 2/3 of the way through the movement. So where does that occur?
Third line down, third measure on the right side.
Exactly. So on the right side on the second page, third line, third measure. And so you typically want to try to then compare the way that that comes back with the way that it was initially stated. And so in talking about form, that's a basic concept. So form has to do with organization. It's the way that a composer organizes material. And so you're looking at things that are the same and then things that are different, and trying to point out those two basic elements. All right, so that then, identifying the recap, then gives you the three main sections, because the second section begins after the double bars. All right, the way that this is presented is very typical of a classical style, and many, many things are typical in this piece. This is a little piece by Clementi. And Clementi was a contemporary of Mozart. There was a very famous playoff between Mozart and Clementi, where they both were competing against each other in a concert. And the audience couldn't decide who was the best. That made Mozart really mad. Mozart called Clementi a mechanicus, that he was just a mechanical artist, not an artist, but a machine. Anyway, Clementi wrote this little work, and so this is from around the 1760s. And the first thing we'll point out just has to do with the phrasing. Basically, this is in a closed pattern, which means that it follows 4-measure phrase lengths. So these are terms that you can use to describe phrasing, and that's something that's basic to this style of music. So, this opening theme is presented in a 4-measure phrase. It's then answered by a second phrase, and then that first phrase is restated. So you have 3 phrases that begin this movement. And then what happens in the second measure of the third line? What happens at that point? So it's the Cali? Yeah, so what happens in the second measure, third line? Something occurs at that point that's kind of... Chromatic. Yes, you start to see an altered tone. And so you have a chromatic element. And what specifically is that altered tone? So within the context of the tonic key, so what is the key of this movement? F major. So what step of the scale is that? 4th. And how is that altered? It's a half step higher. So when you alter the fourth step of the scale and raise it a half step higher, that makes it sound like it's modulating to the dominant key. So if you're in the key of C major and you start to introduce F sharps, it makes it sound like it's going to G major. So in this particular key of F major, by introducing B naturals, then it makes it sound like it's modulating to what key? C major. And that's the key that you expect. That's the dominant key. So this is a typical pattern that you'll find, is that the music is going to modulate to the dominant key. So from that point, then, if you look at the following measures, you see you then consistently have B naturals. It leads to a cadence measure that occurs, and so this phrase actually is an irregular length because it has 5 measures in it. And first measure, the fourth line, then is the cadential measure that then cadences on the downbeat of that second measure. And at that point, then, the B theme is sounded. So the place where you have the B natural is where you should mark the transition that occurs, because that's where the modulation begins. It's not confirmed until you get to the cadence point there on the second measure of the fourth line. What is the harmonic formula that you have that serves as that cadential formula? Taylor, can you analyze that? So we're looking at the first measure of the fourth line.
Yeah.
And so you want to analyze it within the key of C major, because that's what it's doing. It's confirming that new key.
It's 2, 1, and then 5, 7, 1.
Yeah, and what are the inversions? So it's 2,
2, 6.
6,
1, 6, 4.
1, 6, 4,
5, 7.
5, 7. That's one of the most typical cadential patterns. And so you'll see this over and over again. Different variations of this. All right. At that point, then the B theme is presented. And then where it says dolce in the next line, on that fifth line, second measure, that is the B theme that's restated an octave lower. That using that term dolce is typical for this point within the form, because that's a term that's a lyrical term, something that has to do with the singing style. So it's the sweet quality. And so if you look at the way the B theme is initially presented in the 16th notes in that second measure fourth system are going up by step. And then when they go in the opposite direction, what is that called? What's that technique? If you take a melody, instead of presenting it going up, you take the same rhythm and you go down.
Contrary motion.
And that kind of describes that. That basically has to do with like the way that two voices are moving in relationship to each other. But just in a single melody line, that's called inversion, melodic inversion. Okay? So this is another term that you should know. So if you look at the very end of the exposition, that final 3 measures is just a little codetta or a little closing passage. So beginning on that 6th line of the first page, and it's just an ascending scale. If you find the corresponding passage at the end of the movement, what can you say about the final 3 measures of the recap compared to the final 3 measures of the exposition?